I wish you all a really productive conference. We are going to go straight into the next session. So are the panelists for that session already in place? If not, can we invite them up?
Yes. Yeah, okay, thank you very much. So let us move on straight to the next session. We also have a great set of 5 panelists, and I would like to invite them all to come to the front table. But maybe I can just start. So in this session, we are going to start by looking at the latest research on the distribution of environmental hazard and risks, but also benefits. And I'm very delighted to be moderating this session. I'm Kumi Kitamori, Deputy Director, Environment, and I'm about to introduce, I think we have 5 panelists. I think, do we have everyone? One more person? Anybody online or everybody's here?
Hi, I'm online.
Okay,
I'm
great.
Isabel Angeletti.
I'll be introducing you in a minute. So we start with John Fairbairn. He's an Emeritus Professor at Staffordshire University in the UK. Thank you for joining us. And then we also have John Tai Lee. He's a professor at the University of Health Policy, School of Health Policy and Management of the College of Health Sciences in Korean University. We will also be followed by Sakobi Wilson. He's a professor at the Maryland Institute for Applied Environmental Health of the University of Maryland. And then Fiona McLeod, FinChem E. I think we'll hear more about that. She's the chair of Loss Prevention Bulletin Editorial Panel in the UK. And finally, Isabel Agrelowski. She's the director at Barcelona Laboratory for Urban Environmental Justice and Sustainability in Spain. And thanks for joining us online. So, and then you can find more about their biography in the program that we have for this conference. We have a very tight timeline, so we will invite each panelist to give 10-minute intervention, and please hold your questions and thoughts because hopefully we'll have some Q&A discussion at the end. So John, you have the floor. Kick it off.
Okay, thank you. Got a presentation? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I've been working on environmental justice for 25 years. I've worked with all governments in the UK as well as across Europe and mainly with the World Health Organization for over a decade as well. So I'm going to give you a run through on some of the things we found. So starting with the UK, really, what we started with was simple description of social gradients, very easy proximity studies, to give a pattern of what was going on. Start with describing the problem, how widespread it is, how big are the inequalities that we're dealing with. But one of the big studies we did early on had, for the Environment Agency, had such a big effect that we were asked to incorporate that work into the indices of multiple deprivation. So the indices of multiple deprivation is made up of different domains, which are socio-economic and environmental. And that has been used for over 20 years now in the UK to target funding, not just by government departments, but also by charities, by research councils as well. So billions of pounds has been used to allocate that. We've also seen a development over the last 20 years in the use of GIS, public-facing GIS, to provide risk information and other sorts of information as well by different groups. And more recently, I'm going to show you a couple examples of GIS systems which are linked to the threat of global warming. Britain is very lucky in some regards in that we have an incredibly rich data set, series of data sets that we can use. So I'm going to show you some of what is possible when you've got good data. Here's a very early study which was done in Scotland where we were this was for the Scottish government, where we wanted to find out populations and where they were living. So decile 1 are the poorest 10% of the population, decile 10 is the richest. So spatial analysis using postcode and other data. And you can see there that you get this social gradient, as we say, so that if you're in decile 1, you're far more likely to be living close to derelict land. And you can see lots more in the 2005 report if you're interested in that. This was one where we did it in England for the Environment Agency. This was IPC sites, Integrated Pollution Control Sites. Am I speaking too fast? I've just thought for the translators up there. We okay? Wave at me if there's a problem, translators. Okay, good. And so again, you can see we produced a lot of this kind of information early on, which was a result of a change in policy, in part from the UK government being much more interested in making data available. The data was there in the past, but we just couldn't get it at it as academics. So one of the things I'd say to policymakers is see that you can make your data available, preferably digitally, in a form that's useful and can be used, you know. So, and here then, this was back to Scotland, and we had, how do you do something about this? So we can see in the second column, all woodland, population living within 600 meters. SL1 had the lowest, and what the Scottish Forestry Agency had started to do was to use the index of multiple deprivation to spatially target grants. Okay, so we're going to give grants in these areas so that we can have new woodlands and people can access it over time. So completing the link. And since that time, a lot has developed in terms of public GISs to give more and more information to the public, whether it's air quality or whether it's green space, or in this case, this is one from Wales, Natural Resource Wales. And so you can see on the left-hand side, we've got 3 tabs. We've got flood risk, flood warning, and coastal erosion. So people can go in and have a look and see the data, and the data is very good now. And so, you know, Paige was talking about residential sorting. This is part of the data you can put in the UK. You can put your postcode in. The postcode will take you to within 15 houses. Okay, everyone knows their postcode because it's the basis, and the postcode is the basis for our socioeconomic blocks of analysis in government. The postcode is put together to make neighborhoods. It's used to create the census data. And if you start doing that, the important thing is you move away from cross-sectional data to data over time. And if you've got data over time, you can start to analyze the effectiveness of your public policy. What difference are you making? Okay, so you want to try and get to time series data. Now, it took us a long time in the UK to do that. We've had a census since about 1840, but it's only the last 2 or 3 census where we started thinking, how do we create those basic blocks for the census so that we can actually analyze consistently over time and take it into all our other socioeconomic data sets that we want. So we can marry together health, environmental, economic, all sorts of data tagging through the postcodes. This is a lovely piece of work that's come out recently, which gives you some idea. Now, one of the biggest problems that I think we've got in the world, and certainly in Europe, in large parts of Europe for a very long time, we've had a huge amount of excess winter deaths due to poor housing standards. So in Britain, in a bad year, we'll kill 50,000 people because they can't afford to pay their energy bills. And we'll have hundreds of thousands of illnesses because of winter. And we have the same in Spain, Portugal, Italy, places like that. But we've also got an increasing problem with high and long periods of warm weather in Europe now. Again, for the same problem that we've got there. Okay, because the buildings aren't insulated. Now, what this is showing is that you can go onto this GIS, and what this is saying is you can work out how could you start to decarbonize the housing stock. This is telling you with very incredible detail down to an individual building, what level of solar power could be generated from that building. Okay, this is what you can start to do if you've got good data. And that would be my message. Having worked across the World Health Organization for over a decade, far too many countries aren't generating good data to make their decisions. I slightly differ from David in his approach because I think there's multiple approaches needed. I fully take on board the need to include communities and all that kind of thing. But in my experience, in trying to persuade policymakers, they want hard scientific data a lot of the time. They want to know data so they can make policy options because they can think about trade-offs, okay? Now, one of the issues we've got here in Europe at the moment is we've got these EPC certificates, which are all across Europe. And in England, these are now open access. These are updated monthly. So for every building, we've got some information about their energy, the current energy use, and what you could retrofit it to. And I think retrofitting is going to be a huge issue that we're going to need to deal with, especially in cities, to deal with summer warming in particular. And if you've got that information, you can also move away from just individuals thinking about this to social houses providers thinking about how they would do this at a neighborhood level, or a local authority thinking about how they could do it at a neighborhood level as well. On the other piece of work I've been involved with for a long time, this was work done by about 50 experts and stakeholders over several years. And I would point you, if you're new to this area, have a look at the WHO 2019 Environmental Health Inequalities Report. It was written for policymakers. We wrote every chapter to be self-contained to say, this is the problem, this is why it's a problem, this is how widespread the inequalities are, and here's the inequalities both within and between your countries. And we finalized with, here's some simple policy ideas to start with that you could have a look at. There's also systematic reviews available that were written and an environmental health inequalities package. So there was the report, the second assessment report. It covers 5 broad areas, including the environment, that you can have a look at and download. I'm not doing bad for time, am I? And this was the resource package that was written as well, how to start tackling some of these issues. This was aimed at all sorts of people and all sorts of different messages. And it's deliberately quite short, because I know policymakers like to read short documents, okay? It was started by my German colleague who was very German, and I went in and just took an extra large parts of it to get it down so they would read it. Now, where are we? We're nearly up to time. Developments in the US are covered, I think, in the excellent publication that's come out today. If you like GIS, then go and have a look at that kind of stuff. And then this rest of this is just resources. So when the speakers, when the organizers make this available, I've got some other stuff here, how we did flooding for the Environment Agency, some useful resources of the WHO work, some peer review papers, including a German one. And there's my contact details. Feel free to get in touch with me, and if you've got any questions. And I think I'm on time, Chair.
Thank you very much, dot on time, and thanks for the quick overview of the data sources, including GIS data. Sorry. Okay, so let us move on to Professor John Tai Lee. Floor is yours.
I press the button.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone here in and online. And I must have to thank you for OECD and the organizers for giving me this opportunity to share my thought and research findings at this wonderful conference. The focus of today's presentation is to introduce case studies from South Korea that demonstrate how health risk estimate from the PM, fine particulate matter, can vary depending on the context of people or community affected. This presentation will also suggest overlooking these differences in environmental policy can lead to unforeseen and intentional health inequality or environmental injustices. I guess everyone may be familiar with PM, particulate matter. It is a type of air pollutant found in ambient air. We know the smaller particle pose a higher health risk because they can penetrate more deeply into the respiratory tract and often contain more toxic chemical constituent. Therefore, our regulation on PM targets smaller particles such as PM10 and PM2.5. As I will discuss further later, it is essential to understand the health risk of PM are determined not only by the characteristics of particulates themselves, such as their size distribution and chemical composition, but also by various contextual factors, which are the focus of today's presentation. If you look at this slide, you will see significant health disparity attributed to environmental exposure, such as PM. These health disparities are influenced by contextual characteristics, such as differential exposure and varying vulnerabilities across the social, economic, and demographic groups. Differential exposure may arise from living in more polluted area, poor housing condition, and occupational exposure from low-wage jobs. However, when exposed to the same or similar level of pollution, certain groups may experience greater health impact due to their vulnerabilities. These vulnerability factors can include pre-existing medical condition, genetic susceptibility, limited healthcare access, poor nutrition, and psychosocial stresses like violence. As a result, vulnerable population bear a disproportionate health burden from PM and other environmental hazards, even if their exposures are similar to those of less vulnerable groups. Addressing this disparity requires considering both exposure patterns and population susceptibility. Now, I would like to start by presenting example cases from two famous cities, London and Rome, to help you better understand the topic I will be discussing today. And both cities implemented similar policy aimed at reducing traffic congestion and air pollution. But the impact of these policies on health disparity differed between two cities. Police note that in both cities, the area where the policy applied were city centers with relatively high traffic volumes and high level of air pollution. And in London, the congestion charge zone was located in the area with the socioeconomically disadvantaged people. The policy effectively reduced air pollution, with the most socioeconomically deprived areas experienced a greater reduction in PM10 concentration compared to the least deprived area. As a result, the most deprived areas saw greater gains in life expectancy with an estimated 20 years of life gain per 100,000 people over 10 years, versus only 3 years, the least deprived area. In this case, the policy helped to reduce the health disparity by benefiting disadvantaged area the most. In contrast, the opposite pattern was seen in Rome. The policy area in Rome was located in an area with more affluent residents. Consequently, the least deprived area had larger reduction in PM10 levels and greater gains in life expectancy compared to the most deprived area. While the policy effectively reduced the overall pollution level, it had the unintended consequence of worsening health disparity by disproportionately benefiting socioeconomically advantaged people. This contrasting example highlights the importance of considering the socioeconomic context when designing air pollution interventions, rather than solely focusing on reducing overall pollution level. As an example of London and Rome demonstrate the health risk from PM is not solely determined by the pollution itself. As you can see in this slide, the health risk can be thought of as the combined function of two factors such as exposure levels and hazard associated with each unit of exposure. From this simple concept of risk, we can say ultimate goal of environmental management and policy is risk management, especially risk reduction. Traditionally, most of the environmental policies and interventions have focused primarily on reducing exposure to achieve the targeted risk reduction. However, I want to note that there is another way to decrease the overall risk level by reducing hazard. While reducing exposure is undoubtedly important, it is equally crucial to consider strategies that reduce the hazard. This is particularly relevant for addressing health disparity, as the hazard itself can vary between different socioeconomic and demographic groups. Now let's explore some of my research findings as an example of how the hazard of PM can vary across different population and contexts, leading to unequal health risk. We found people of low socioeconomic status and those living in deprived region experience greater risk of asthma hospitalization. This indicates a higher hazard level for disadvantaged groups, even when they experience the same level of pollution as more advantaged group. And in this study, we also found that region with more limited medical resources and less green spaces had a strong association between long-term PM 2.5 exposure and mortality. We estimate the relative risk of PM increment of 10 microgram per cubic meter by contextual area characteristics, such as medical resources and greenness. Here, NDVI is the widely used index for measuring and monitoring plant health or vegetation covers using remote sensing data from satellite. Again, this suggests the hazard or risk is higher in area with certain contextual disadvantages. People with disabilities are an understudied group in air pollution epidemiology. Our recent study revealed people with disabilities suffer greater risk from PM10 exposure compared to the non-disabled individuals, even when they are exposed to the same or similar level of air pollution. In air pollution epidemiology, considering lag is important because it allows us to account for delayed effect from air pollution exposure. For example, lag 1 refers to evaluating the association between health risk on a specific day and air pollution level from 1 day prior. I believe this is the last slide on my research finding. As I mentioned before, the composition and source of PM also matter. In South Korea, PM 2.5 constituent and source like secondary nitrate, diesel emission, and combustion-related source exhibit higher mortality risk. This implied the health risk of PM may vary, especially depending on the source profile of different communities. In fact, our other study finding shows a clear spatial variation of PM health risk across cities we studied. In summary, a variety of contextual factors can influence the hazard and determine the health disparity associated with the PM. These factors include individual and area level socioeconomic status, disabilities, social medical infrastructure, residential greenness, and the chemical composition of the particulate mixture. So in conclusion, it is critical to recognize the health effect of PM are not just determined by the mass concentration, but vary across different populations and contexts. Therefore, policies that fail to consider this context may unintentionally worsen health disparity. To comprehensively address the health risk of PM and promote environmental justice, future policies should aim to reduce both exposure and hazard. This may involve targeted measures to protect vulnerable population, improve healthcare access, enhance green spaces, and mitigate the impact of a specific pollutant source that are particularly harmful. I believe the context-based tailored environmental policy can contribute significantly to achieving environmental justice. Additionally, the recent trend in big data and information technology make it increasingly feasible to quantitatively assess various context-based health risk. Together, we can work toward more equitable environmental policy, better management, and improved public health protection. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee, for sharing the results of your latest research on the unequal health. I'm not managing very well the microphone. Oh, okay. So thank you, panelists, so far for being very much on time. So this means hopefully we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. So please think about any questions that you may want to pose to the panelists. So keep your thoughts. Now I would like to invite Professor Sackerby Wilson. The floor is yours.
And you said 10 minutes, right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, well, I'm Dr. Wilson. I'm gonna keep going to my next slide. So when we think about environmental justice, I want to say real quickly, it's about human rights. So that's how it connects to the whole world. It's about humanizing communities that have been decommodified, right? Procedural justice, making sure the law is followed. Representative justice, those who are most impacted, that voices have heard. Restorative justice, let's restore the communities, right? Distributional justice, making sure there's justice in the distribution of benefits, okay? So just wanted to say that real quickly. When I think about environmental justice, and we've already heard about leg 1, of this EJ stool. Leg 2, these communities are overburdened by psychosocial stressors, so poverty, crime, isms. Leg 3, very important to this part of the panel, is lack of access to infrastructure. So you may know Antonovsky, the term salutogenesis, how you promote health, well-being, wellness across all dimensions of the environment, built, social, natural, political, economic, and spiritual. So you think about differential access to amenities, whether it be clean rivers and streams, green space, access to housing, access to healthcare. In America, you know, racism is a big part of the reason why we have environmental justice. And so we have some communities that have, due to their race, ethnicity, have a pollution advantage, and some communities have a pollution disadvantage due to their race, ethnicity. So some folks experience 17% less air pollution exposure, and some groups experience excess air pollution exposure because there's a differential burden of the hazards in those communities, which leads to differential exposure, differential risks, and differential health outcomes. So in many communities that are dealing with traffic-related air pollution, acting as trap, you're going to see high rates of asthma in the US. This is an example of agriculture-related disparities. In North Carolina, there's a lot of what we call concentrated animal feeding operations. These are very large hog farms. And so they're primarily in the eastern physiologic plain of North Carolina. And so you see disparities in the distribution based on race and ethnicity. And just real quickly, you know, thinking about the context of environmental oppression and slavery in the US, if you look at an overlay of those hog farms in comparison to the enslaved population in 1860, you see a spatial correlation. So racism is a major driver of environmental injustice in America, classism as well, but race is the single biggest predictor of the distribution of environmental hazards in the US right now. So let's think about climate change and environmental justice. When we think about climate change real quickly, you're talking about inequities in preparedness, response, recovery, mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. Many of you may know about Hurricane Katrina. They hit New Orleans in 2005. Primarily Black folks were impacted. It hit at the end of the month in August. People hadn't been paid yet. If you're low income in New Orleans, Louisiana, you didn't have a card. You couldn't escape, okay? So when you think about those who are most impacted, you may not believe in climate change, but in America, it believes in you if you're Black, if you're poor, if you don't have health care, if you live in the floodplain, if you don't have community voice, if you've been marginalized, it believes in you. Y'all get that? I can use that one. Okay. So when you think about in the US, and classically, most environmental justice issues in the US are connected in some form or fashion to fossil fuel infrastructure, whether it be extraction, transport, processing at refineries, of course, the combustion in our cars and the vehicles at coal-fired power plants and gas-fired power plants, and also the waste that's produced, right? The ash, for example. So this is just a report for NAACP, and cut me off because I'm not looking at time. When it's time to cut me off, please cut me off. Because I'm a talker, sorry. And so when you look at NAACP's report, found that many of the coal-fired power plants were located in close proximity to people of color in low-income communities. And another report from NAACP, Themes Across the Fence Line, we talk about natural gas. That's a euphemism. It's fossil gas, y'all. Dinosaur gas. It's a better term for it, okay? And so you find that more people, again, of color and low-income folks are living near these gas-fired plants as well, okay? And then you think about, you know, redlining, this whole first presentation about, you know, economic policies in the US. Some communities, because of the number of people of color in it, we're not gonna give them loans. We don't like you, right? We're not gonna give you loans. And if you're white in America, oh, we're gonna give you loans. So those neighborhoods were redlined, didn't have access to housing loans and other types of investments. So what you see is, when you think about the urban heat island effect, redline neighborhoods are hotter in the US compared to non-redline neighborhoods because the redline neighborhoods have more asphalt, have more concrete, have less trees, less shading and cooling, less evapotranspiration, right? So that's what we see in the US as well. And then heat waves are hell for the poor and the elderly. So in this trend line, what you see is older folks are dying more from heat issues. And also non-Hispanic Blacks are impacted more compared to whites in the US. And then I love one of the early presentations about mapping tools. So we develop a lot of mapping tools, what we call environmental justice screening mapping tools. It can create composite maps. So this is basically just showing you how we created this composite environmental justice score. We have various domains. You have a climate change domain. You have a socioeconomic domain. You have like the burdens, you know, the facilities, coal-fired power plants, refineries. You also have exposures, like as the previous presentation, particulate matter exposure, diesel exhaust exposure, and health indicators like asthma, cancer rates. So you combine it all into a score. And so we did this work for the National Academy of Medicine's Climate Communities Network, where we created a national map to look at these index scores, right? And so you can see the Midwest as a region had higher scores than other parts of the country. And so for those of you who are interested, you can look at the National Academy of Medicine report. Also, the 5th National Climate Assessment, our recent assessment. For the first time, we really focus on environmental justice. So that's another report that may be a good reference for everyone from different parts of the world. And so I'm gonna now zoom into the state of Maryland. Now we talk about, I know this slide is a little bit hard to see, to summarize for you real quickly. Many communities that are both overburdened by hazards, in this case, toxic release inventory facilities, may also be underserved by infrastructure, in this case, healthcare infrastructure. So we have health professional shortage areas. So the places that have more hazards, they have less access to healthcare infrastructure. And you see that differential access based on race, based on age of housing, based on income. And so again, you see these patterns, these spatial patterns across the US, and how access is really differential across racial lines, across economic lines. And this is a map using that previous composite score for the state of Maryland. And you can see, again, it's the color shading, right? So we have tracts, 682 census tracts that are above the 50th percentile. And then the top 100 worst affected census tracts in Maryland, many of those, 89% of those tracts are in Baltimore City. So again, you think about segregation, when you think about redlining, lack of access to housing loans, the lack of access to good housing, the concentration of social risk, economic risk, political risk, environmental risk. Segregation is a major driver of environmental justice in the US. And we created mapping tools to map access to infrastructure like green space. And this is another tool that y'all can do this yourselves, build your own national tool, a city level tool to look at access to green space or access to parks. I just want to give you a quick example of this tool as well. I'm gonna keep going because I know, how much more time do I have? Okay, cool. Let me slow down something, sorry. And then just to zoom in even more to the city of Baltimore, I talked about the issue of segregation. Dr. Lawrence Brown, who's a professor at Morgan State University, wrote a book called The Black Butterfly. So you think about the butterfly wings have been hyper segregated with people of color, Hispanic and Black, and the body of the butterfly more racially diverse, but have higher income folks in the body of the butterfly, okay? So what we see is in the areas that are hyper segregated, home prices and home sales are much lower in the wings of the butterfly compared to the body of the butterfly. When you look at redlining health issues, we talked about life expectancy before. Where you live can kill you, right? And then we say in the US, your zip code is more important than genetic code. Place matters, context matters. Again, when we see spatial patterns of lower life expectancy in the butterfly wings compared to the body of the butterfly. You look at lead issues. We know that lead is a neurocognitive intoxicant. Lead is a major environmental justice issue in the US context. And we see, again, the number of lead cases and lead violations. You see higher numbers in the wings of the butterfly compared to the body of the butterfly. Asthma, air pollution, environmental justice, as a previous speaker just talked about, particulate matter is a major driver of asthma and also heart disease and high blood pressure, the infant mortality, and low birth weight babies, right? Cancer and life expectancy. So you see, again, those same kind of patterns in those areas that are colored red and yellow. You're seeing a higher number of cases of asthma in the city of Baltimore. And this is what you see across the US in our major cities. Again, getting back to heat island, you see in the butterfly wings, higher temperatures again, because there's fewer trees, there's more asphalt. There's the whole albedo effect, for those of you familiar with that. So that's a big issue in Baltimore. And there was a project done, we talked about citizen science earlier, where students from the College of Journalism School at the University of Maryland They went to Baltimore to put temperature sensors in neighborhoods in across Baltimore. And what we found is, it's just not across the wings, everyone, on the same street, on the same block, on the same set of row houses, the power of one tree. You can see a 20 to 25 difference in temperature from house to house when you don't have a tree. Trees are good for heat mitigation, air pollution mitigation, noise mitigation, right? Also shading, cooling, bringing energy bills down. So trees are important for energy justice, okay? So this is what you see in this study. And you can do this again in other parts of the world as well. Do this kind of citizen science work. And you also see a major connection between heat and health. So when it comes to respiratory distress, disease, diabetes, again, you can see spatial patterns where higher the heat is, the more health problems that people are having in those areas that have high heat. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for providing us with a wide range of evidence, specifically from the US on this inequality in exposure to hazard, but also access to amenity. So thank you for that. And I'm sure you all have questions, so hold your thoughts, because I think we will have time for discussions. And now speeding on to Fiona McLeod to present her case on industrial excellence, if I understand correctly. Thank you.
Just while we're waiting for the presentation to come up, I know I've been really, really interested to hear the different takes on what environmental justice is. And my presentation really is a case study. It's harder to define environmental justice than it is to call out environmental injustice when you see it. So Bhopal, I think, is one of the most egregious examples of where something has gone really badly wrong and continues to do so 40 years on. Last summer, I went back to Bhopal. I've worked in India. I went for my second visit to the site of the world's worst industrial accident. I was only a year into my professional life as a chemical engineer in 1984 when we heard news of a terrible tragedy at the Union Carbide factory in India. This is a picture of the site last summer. As you can see, it's still standing. Some of you weren't even born in 1984, so let's go back a little to what happened. So just after midnight on the night of the 2nd to 3rd of December, 1984, at the Union Carbide India factory in Bhopal, India, 28 tons of toxic gas was released into the community. Water had entered a tank of an intermediate called methyl isocyanate, which was an intermediate in the manufacture of pesticides. It led to the evolution of it led to a runaway reaction, which released a cocktail of toxic gases. It came out of the top of a chimney, spread outside of the factory walls, and spread through the sleeping town. Thousands died and hundreds of thousands were injured. There was never a really good investigation. There are several different investigations that were done. More recently, an American reliability engineer, Kenneth Bloch, has done a fantastic job of pulling together all of the different contemporaneous reports and the experience of engineers around the world to try and get to a more convincing root cause. Of course, we'll never really know the full answer. But there were many contributing causes. The factory was uneconomic. There'd been a problem with part of the technology, not the technology for the methyl isocyanate, but the technology for the alpha naphthol. And the factory never made any money. So it was in the process of closing down. In fact, it was due to close at the end of December. The accident happened on the 2nd to 3rd of December. There was a large increase of inventory of toxic materials as they processed the final raw materials. There was a loss of experienced staff. The people who could leave did leave. And they got into the habit of a lot of operational workarounds. experienced people left weren't replaced, and equipment was run to failure. But you can go back further and look at some of the root causes, which is of most interest, I think, when we're looking at how we, rather than talking about environmental justice after something has gone wrong, how we make sure that we design to prevent things going wrong in the first place. The process hazard analysis really failed to recognize that storing such a large quantity of such lethal chemicals in the center of a town, and much has been made of the fact that slums grew up around the factory because it was a good place to work. But in fact, it was only 2 kilometers from a major railway station, and also a main railway junction ran right through the site. There were other decisions which were made, again, incredibly complicated because you had several different parties involved, but the Indian government were very keen on making India more self-reliant and having more Indian-made materials. So there were a lot of requirements put on the technology transfer to ensure that the costs were kept down to a minimum. Choices made in materials of construction, in particular the vent header, was made of carbon steel, where in America it would have been made of stainless steel. And equipment reliability decisions were taken, which allowed a lot more manual work to be done with the aim of employing more people, but with disastrous results. So on the night of the accident, the final batch of methyl isocyanate was distilled in the middle of October. On the 31st of October in 1984, Indira Gandhi was assassinated, and there followed a period of great unrest in India, a lot of civil unrest across the country, and Bhopal, as the capital of Madhya Pradesh, was no different in imposing a nighttime curfew. So the final batch that had been distilled sat in a tank for 6 weeks without any sampling or any action being taken, without any refrigeration. And when it came to the last month, when finally the curfew had been lifted and the process operators who were left tried to process this material, the safest way to deal with it was to turn it into product. They found that they couldn't make the transfer, and most probably in a misguided attempt to clear a vent line, they used water to wash. The water got into a tank, started a runaway reaction, and led to the release of the toxic gas. It spread the area, this area, that, I mean, by the way, Bhopal is the most beautiful city. If anyone ever gets the chance to visit, it's so sad that it's associated with this horrific chemical accident, but it is one of the loveliest cities. But there's a relatively wealthy upper town and a very poor lower town where the factory was situated. The people in that immediate area woke up in a panic, eyes streaming, throats burning. They had absolutely no idea what to do. And many of them were actually killed in the stampede to try and get away from the gas. We'll probably never know how many people were killed. Government of India affidavit in 2006 put the official number at 15,248 deaths and 550,000 people injured. It's an unimaginable scale, but the suffering is very real, and the shocking thing is that it continues today. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip quickly through the next slides. I'm very grateful to my colleagues in the chemical accident prevention working group who've invited me to collaborate and work with them on giving this presentation. And one of the questions that we asked is, had the guiding principles for chemical accident prevention been around in 1984? In fact, I believe they were partly as a result of the Bhopal accident that these guidelines were prepared. And it's pretty clear to me that if those guidelines had been in place and followed, this sort of accident could not have happened, excuse me. But thanks to Eva Lenala and Marianne Bauscher and Mark Halewood for drawing my attention also to the guidance on managing change. So as we run down, hopefully, our fossil fuel capabilities, we mustn't ever forget that some of the most hazardous things happen when you're trying to close an industry and when you start losing your skilled people, but you still have large facilities which need to be run safely until you don't need them anymore. Skipping quickly through, prevention is always better than cure. You reduce your minimize to a minimum. You reduce your inventory of hazard materials to a minimum. You keep people away from danger. In Bhopal, none of these things happened. Large quantities of hazardous intermediate, a lot of manual work, very little automation, materials of constructions that were inappropriate, and loss of trained staff. In terms of preparing, the importance of emergency planning, land use planning, and communication, none of which were effective in the Bhopal accident. The flare, which should have vented, should have allowed the hazardous gas to be burnt and made safe. The vent gas scrubber wasn't in operation. The refrigeration had been decommissioned, and a water curtain, which might have mitigated the release, was insufficient. There was no public alarm, and there had been a growth of communities around the site. And the communities had not been informed really of what was happening on the site. Responding again, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. I'll skip the next one, but the most important thing I think for me now is the follow-up. So I've never seen anything where the polluter pays principle has been so mocked, because the site is now in a state where nobody has responsibility for it. The chemical plant equipment, piping and structures have been left to corrode. They're in an increasingly dangerous state. There's no meaningful security. Access to the wasteland is open to all, including children who use it as a climbing frame and play cricket on Sundays. There are grazing domestic animals there, and so children would be drinking the milk and people will be eating the meat. There's about 350 tons of packaged hazardous waste on sites, which needs to be safely disposed of, but that's not the real problem. The real problem is the soil. So the soil inside the site is contaminated. There were large toxic dumping areas. There's been no care taken over the membrane to prevent the toxins leaking into the groundwater, and the surrounding communities continue to suffer. So to me, the second tragedy is the environmental tragedy. And those problems predate the 1984 accident. In many countries, many hot countries, it's quite common to deal with hazardous waste by creating a large pond, which has got an impermeable barrier and allowing the sun to evaporate the water. And then when the solids, you can then scrape the solids up and dispose of those. But because the site was effectively abandoned after the accident, those things have not been maintained. And so all the toxic chemicals, and we're talking about lead, mercury, chromium, and a lot of organic chlorides and persistent organic pollutants have leached into the groundwater. The communities affected still haven't been provided with a reliable source of clean drinking water, even though many promises have been made over the years. It's still not there, doesn't exist. You might get a weekly delivery of plastic bottles of water, which, but there's no piped water to all the communities affected. And the plume is spreading, the underground plume is spreading. So the 46 communities that were originally affected, there's now considerably more. So I think, excuse me if I've overrun, but my final message really is that the time to think about environmental justice is before you design and construct something, and that building an error tolerance is absolutely critical. Inherent safety by design is all about substituting more hazardous chemicals for less hazardous materials, minimizing the amount you store, simplifying the operation, and moderating where you can't do the above. I would hope that we have some people in the room who have some idea how we would break the impasse. And in December, it'll be the 40th anniversary, and there is still no plan for a cleanup of the site or aid to the communities around it. I don't have an answer. An NGO in Delhi, the Science Center for Science and Environment, brought together all the different parties, did a tremendous job in getting a lot of people who didn't really like talking to each other around a table and coming up, which is not so much as a plan, but more here are the next things we'd have to do. We have to do boreholes. We have to do proper sampling. We need data so that we can actually address the problem. But there's been no progress since 2013. In fact, things have gone backwards. Fortunately, I can't show you the videos that I took in August, but I think we're going to put them up on the website. So if anyone's interested, you'll be able to see. And yes, if we can, as a community, if we can deal with a situation as complicated as Chernobyl, as was done with the fantastic investment in the new safe confinement. I went to visit Chernobyl not long after I visited Bhopal, then surely it must be possible for us as a community to do something about Bhopal. And if we're serious about environmental justice, let's start with the worst example of environmental injustice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I actually was in India for a chemical safety conference not long ago, and one of the participants was a regulator. He lived through the escape. He survived the stampede as a child. He experienced this, so it's a very specific case. Thank you. And we have last but not least, Isabel from joining online. She's going to talk from her finding from her work at Barcelona Laboratory for Urban Environmental Justice. I hope you're still there online. Over to you.
Yes, I'm here. Let me try to share my screen. Okay. Thank you so much. So a pleasure to be here, everyone, and be part of this really important body of scholarship and activism against environmental injustices. I get reminded of so many, horrible cases and trends I learned actually about during my doctoral program a long time ago. And so it's really nice to be part of you all. I'm sorry to be online. What I wanted to talk about today is a little bit of a different dynamic of environmental injustice, which has to do with what happens to historically vulnerable groups when their neighborhood becomes greener, becomes more climate resilience, and where can people go? Or better said, where and what happens to them when they are not able to resist real estate speculation and displacement processes that are part of what in my research group and much broader we call green gentrification, and nowadays even climate gentrification. So I'm not talking about toxics. I'm talking about actually the good stuff when you improve your neighborhood. And here, we have many cases of neighborhoods like the ones that Professor Wilson talked about, neighborhoods in the US and Europe that have fought for decades to get rid of highly toxic factories, car contamination, and now even to make their neighborhood more heat resilient and greener, and who are now being displaced. So let me describe a bit this process. But basically the broader question behind our research, and I'm an environmental planner, an urban planner by design, ask ourselves are the following: to what extent does green resilient infrastructure address climate justice needs rather than reproduce existing inequalities? And so what we see here is that in relationship to climate change, socially vulnerable groups are those who have least contributed to climate change and cannot easily adapt to the impacts they are much more exposed to than other groups, but also we are seeing that they are displaced by climate resilient infrastructure, either directly because so-called seawalls or resilient shorelines or elevated parks come to protect neighborhoods against sea level rise, but oftentimes directly informal settlements get destroyed by this infrastructure when actually high-end residences get to stay. So, it's a little bit about the unequal enforcement of land use regulations. But what we also see is that there's an indirect displacement process, which is what I'm going to talk about today. So what do we see in cities? We see that there's a lot of investment around green infrastructure because they are seen as multifunctional infrastructure. They have great climate benefits. They are low cost, and they also have actually an important positive economic effect on the neighborhood and on the city as a whole. You see places like Boston, where I lived for many years, where there's a whole branding around greening in that particular case, around the 75 square miles of waterfront that are being greened against sea level rise, against flooding, and also against heat in Boston. And all of these green narrative and these green investments also position cities against, in some ways, one another, or in competition with one another for who is the greenest city, who is the most sustainable, or who is the most livable city. So in some way, greening is not only, let's say, this win-win benefit, this win-win infrastructure for improved environmental and climate conditions and resilience. It's also part of an economic growth agenda. It's also embedded in broader investment, attractiveness, dynamics that are meant to bring in more creative classes, more higher end residents, and nowadays one would even say digital nomad residents to many of these cities that are considered the greenest in the world. And so here again, going back to the initial question, for whom actually are those infrastructure? For whom are these green resilient districts in the mid and in the long term? My argument, and the one of our broader research group, the Barcelona Lab for Urban Environmental Justice and Sustainability, is that we are actually seeing a paradox, which is that regardless of whether green infrastructure either accelerates, produces, or contributes to what we call gentrification and displacement, or whether actually displacement takes place, let's say, independently in a neighborhood that's being greened, there is a form of segregative nature of greening, because you will see that at the end of the day, the more socially vulnerable residents will end up being displaced to neighborhoods that will be more toxic, more heat exposed, and in general with less nature. So this is kind of this green paradox, right? This is not just, let's say, about trying to address deep inequities in access to green space, which many of these projects are also about. It's not about climate change only. It's also about deep inequities in who has access to trees, to parks, to greenways, to restored shorelines. It's also actually a fact that at the end of the day, you will have a new form of displacement taking place, right? So how do we trace that? How do we study that in our research group? We look at then what we call green gentrification trends. So we've done a study in close to 30 cities, 30 mid-sized cities in North America and Europe, across a variety of growth trends, historic development trends, even, climate exposure trends, etc. And what we've tried to see here, and that's a little bit of a complex graph that you have in front of you, is testing the extent to which urban greening, what we call urban greening 2.0, that is the recent investment in nature-based solutions, in green infrastructure, that has taken place over the last 10 years or so, the extent to which this produces or accelerates gentrification. Gentrification, which we conceive as the replacement of working class, more racialized neighborhoods, with a higher population of people of color, higher income residents. Basically, these neighborhoods losing socially vulnerable groups that are being replaced by these more, let's say, elite or privileged residents. And we also look at these through the lens of real estate prices. That is, how are these neighborhoods that are being greened changing from a real estate affordability standpoint in comparison with those that haven't. So it's very complex. We do a lot of spatial modeling here, but we are looking at three different processes that take place. How greening produces or accelerates gentrification through the building or marketing of green homes, the increasing land and property values, and also in some ways the social cultural exclusion that takes place in the context of greening, people feeling that they are not welcomed anymore in their particular greened area. So a first study that we did was looking actually at 99 cities in North America and Europe, where we looked at the ones that had the greatest green brand and those also who were, you know, across different ranges of affordability. And what we found in our quantitative analysis is that there's a high statistically significant association between high levels of urban green branding and high levels of unaffordability. Put differently, the greener the city, the more unaffordable it is, which then triggers this dynamic where you only have kind of a form of elite capture of the benefits or to the benefits of greening. We also interviewed 150 developers and real estate agents in 15 cities, so among the ones that you showed, that I showed on the map, to better understand how do investors capture greening. What is the value of greening for them? And what we found is that high-end developers, especially those that are actually able to capture the benefits of greening, find three ways in extracting what we call rent from investing in greening or building in the vicinity of new green spaces. There's a form of financial and aesthetic value because they can advertise property for higher prices. They can also get better interest rates and financial conditions when they start to build. And they also are the ones who end up selling for their clients the health and social and societal benefits of greening. So there is this kind of idea that greening is for the middle class people or for higher end residents. This is not for, you know, a diversity or greater diversity of residents, especially not the working class or the people of color who were living in those neighborhoods before they became greener. We also have done a very, very large quantitative analysis where we have categorized and identified thousands and thousands of green spaces, new green spaces between 1990 and 2016 in different cities, and looked spatially at how much have those green spaces contributed to gentrification, which we have measured at the kind of the census tract level. That is, how, again, have neighborhoods changed demographically and from a price standpoint in areas that have been greened. What we see is that in the majority of our cities, greening explains gentrification in a statistically significant manner. And we see three different ways, either because greening is the leading, at the right here, on the right here of the little figure, either greening is the lead factor to explain gentrification among a variety of factors that we have analyzed, including new transit, including new real estate development. And you see here cities that are known for being the greenest cities among a much broader spectrum of cities in the world. Copenhagen being one of them, Nantes, which was the European Green Capital Award a decade ago, or Vancouver. You also see spaces where greening is integrated with other dynamics of neighborhood change and development to explain gentrification. That's the case, for example, of Barcelona, where I'm based, or Boston. And then other areas where greening might play a less substantive role, like in Detroit, or Philly, or DC, but still accelerates a gentrification that was already taking place. Now, if we move to climate gentrification in particular, this is a specific subset of our research where we look at climate resilient infrastructure in particular. The greening infrastructure that helps against heat, against flooding, for improved stormwater management, among others. And what we find in general are dynamics of exclusive climate protection, maladaptation, and unequal green climate security in neighborhoods that, or in cities that have become greener to protect themselves against climate change. So let me give you an example of how we also managed to trace this empirically. We look at climate gentrification risks in a variety of let's say, threats to these neighborhoods. These neighborhoods have social risks at first. For example, they have a greater proportion of elderly residents or migrant residents. There are those that are impacted by a variety of climate impacts. They also have new resilience investments. There are neighborhoods where financial costs are a burden for vulnerable groups, and they also are going through neighborhood change and developments. That is, specific zoning mechanisms or financial incentives that will bring developers and investors in a more, let's say, easy manner to those neighborhoods. And so if you look at a case of a neighborhood where we've looked at these different characteristics of climate gentrification risks, let me give you the example of Philadelphia. So Philadelphia is a city that has been greened in the large scale and in small scale projects to address heat and stormwater management issues. So that's a map of all of the census tracts of Philly, which are all of the polygons there. And what you see is that the neighborhoods that are, for example, in pink and in blue here are those that have either moderate social vulnerability or high social vulnerability, and at the same time, high environmental vulnerability. So from an environmental justice needs standpoint, one would think that green resilient infrastructure should go there. Well, that's not exactly where they go. Green resilient infrastructure, yes, goes to areas with higher ecological vulnerabilities, but actually in higher income and already privileged areas of the city. And on the contrary, so neighborhoods that are very exposed to climate impacts and have lower income residents and racialized groups are not getting this climate resilient infrastructure. You also track how gentrification has progressed over time against this investment in green resilient infrastructure. And what we see, for example, is that the areas that have most gentrified between 2000 and 2016, which are the dark green and the lower, let's say, slightly less green polygons, are also those where green resilient infrastructure has gone. So again, residents from wider, higher income come in, and they are the ones who are able to either acquire or attract investments that protect them against climate impacts.
Isabel,
and then from a population shift standpoint, what you see is that the area of Phillies that have gained Black residents during that same decade and a half, 2000 and 2016, on the left, for example, these are all of the red and dark red polygons, are those that have over time gotten least amounts of green resilient infrastructure. So a complete spatial and social mismatch in relationship to where greening goes, where climate protection goes, and where actually the most vulnerable resident from a racial standpoint and a social standpoint.
Thank you, Isabel. Are you almost wrapping up?
Yes. Yeah. And that's my last slide here. So basically to describe the fact that when you zoom in qualitatively on the different processes I'm describing, in general, in gentrifying neighborhoods, working class and racialized groups see short-term benefits of green infrastructure. They welcome investments, but they are very much aware of the fact that these benefits will be short-term, and before too long, they will be displaced to much less climate protective areas. And they will also lose aspects of social networks, care, and deeper, let's say, community relations that they had in their original neighborhood. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So there's also an inequality in access to amenities, as we've seen. I already see one flag up, and sorry, we didn't have as much time, or two flags. So maybe let's take two questions. Italy, please introduce yourself and then say to whom your question is addressed.
Aldo Ravazzi from Italy, Ministry of Environment. Fantastic panels, fantastic presentations, and we all are grateful, I think, for all this work. A minor technical observation to Professor Lee. When you talk about London and Rome, I'm afraid London is more on pricing, Rome is more on zoning. Rome is not adopting pricing, whereas Milan has adopted pricing, but your results are satisfactory and correspond to what we know. My feeling is that as we are all convinced by environmental justice, we have to go forward, and we should avoid the problem of confusion with some other aspects, because most of these environmental justice aspects are related to human rights justice, to income and wealth distribution, to ethnical, racial, and other aspects. So how can we be more precise on environmental justice? We are, from the environmental economic community, asking too much probably to us, the environmental issue. We want health justice, we want transport justice, we want home justice, etc., etc. So sometimes we have to make a very strong distinction. I don't know if any of the speakers can react to that.
Okay, thank you. We'll quickly take questions and then come to answers. And if you could also be brief with your...
Thank you. I'm Volker Holubetz from Austria. I have one comment and one question to make with regard to Fiona's presentation. And before me, let me also say that I find very excellent to have this discussion, and it's very, very valuable for us. When I come to my question, you will see why. When you described Bhopal case, I was so much frightened that we did not learn anything, as it came to my mind that in Beirut, Lebanon, we just had a few years ago a very similar case. Maybe the death tolls or the injuries were not the same, but the root cause, as you described it, was exactly the same. And maybe we have not learned anything from Bhopal when it comes to ammonia and how to store it, and who is responsible in the end. So I would really think that we need to dig deeper into how we can distribute any learnings from one root cause also to the rest of the world. What is my question is much more for all the speakers now is, I'm a bit lost when I look to my own country, where protests are coming from very young people. They are white, they are rich, and they know everything on their side, and they would consider us all here in this room, all, as the establishment, and that is what they are against. And if you are driving from a very remote area of Austria to one of the cities with your car, and you are blocked by people who are gluing themselves on the highway, and you argue, well, but I'm working for the environment, but my boss will also be angry with me as I'm coming too late today, 2 hours and more, and I have no other possibility than using that car. How would you explain me that? These people would argue with an inequality and injustice argument, although they are not coming from a group which is socially sorted out, or which is racially somewhere else, or which constitute a nationality that is not the major nationality in Austria. And I think that is what we are experiencing, and I have not heard any answers. Did you have done any of your analysis also in this area, where you have looked at the question of how do young people react to environmental injustice? Thank you.
Please, panelists, hold that thoughts. And then one last question from US. Please be very brief, and then we go to the panelists.
There we go. So good afternoon, and thank you. My name is Kareem Marshall. I am the new senior advisor at the United States Environmental Protection Agency in our Office for Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights. And I wanted to make sure that I took time to thank the presenters for your brilliant presentations, to Shardul and his team for the wonderful report that they've put together, and also to the countries that were responsive to the inquiry that he put out. Just very quickly, I just wanted to note that EPA has developed several tools and policies to facilitate and support the incorporation of environmental justice considerations into agency actions. EPA is committed to addressing cumulative impacts or the combined exposures to numerous chemical and non-chemical stressors, such as poverty and housing conditions that were brought up earlier today. Now, these can cause, perpetuate, or exacerbate disproportionate environmental and public health risks. I wanted to talk a lot more about a couple other things, but due to time, I'm actually just going to hand it over to my colleague, Ann Wolverton, who has a couple of technical questions she wanted to put on the record.
Thanks, Kareem. I'll keep it brief. I have some ideas maybe for tomorrow's discussion, but yeah, a couple of the speakers, both in the previous session and this session, talked about the role of sorting, of spatial sorting. And I guess I'd like to hear more about, that seems particularly challenging to take on in the context of place-based policies. Redlining is a case in point where in some regions of the United States, you see formerly redlined areas that have been gentrified and you know, have a different environmental sort of look different environmentally, but also the people who live there also look fundamentally different. So you've got people being pushed out, and those dynamics complicate, I think, to some degree, the way that we think about the effective policies on health disparities, and in particular on the way we think about benefits and costs of different policies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm also mindful of the coffee break that's late, and the interpreters also need a break, but maybe let me turn to the panelists for quick 1 minute or less answers to some of the questions. Maybe we can start from one side to the other, and specifically to Professor Lee and Fiona, there were specific questions.
I'll deal with a question from our colleague from Italy. The reason why we can't have an integrated approach to this is because government departments, government agencies have a specific remit, and they're not very good at working outside the remit. So you have to try and bring them together. If we were in academia, we'd say this is an interdisciplinary problem. So that is the reason. So we've got an environment agency, and my colleague here, Joe Smith, from the Environment Agency, has been working on environmental justice, but that is why. And to be fair, the EU with the ERDF fund has allowed the funding of projects to bring together environment and health people and other people to work in these communities, and more needs to happen. But that's why we have to talk about environmental justice, because environment agencies have an environmental focus.
Yeah, I also agree that there is various aspects and ways to tackle these environmental justice issues. But what I want to express in my presentation is to policymakers should consider the effectiveness of policy would not be transferred equally to another setting or another context. So without considering those differences, then we may have unexpectedly, intentionally result for worsening this health disparities. So that's what I'm saying. Thank you.
Just to the colleague from Austria, I think you make a very important point, is when things get tied up in legal arguments about who's responsible and who's to blame, it's very difficult to learn lessons. So having open investigations after something goes wrong, which are not about apportioning blame, but are about making sure that an accident like Bhopal never happens again, would be a really welcome change. And I think the work that the OECD Chemical Accidents Group, the Working Party, is doing is fantastic in that respect. But maybe we can talk more afterwards.
Yeah, so Austria, young people have a lot of climate anxiety. That's driving part of it. So I didn't say earlier, types of justice, from an intergenerational justice perspective, how do we engage them, right? So how do you build bridges? That's gonna be important, because my little girl says, Daddy, how you call yourself a doctor plant? You still got a gas guzzling car. You don't have solar in your house. And she's 9, she started at 6. So we all have a lot of work to do in engaging the younger people and making sure their voices are heard, but they're not otherized as they're trying to, share the voices. Then the EPA real quick. I think just for everyone in this room, distributional justice is important. You heard from the last speaker about the green gentrification, climate gentrification. We have to bake that into our models, and we have to ground truth our policies to make sure that the people who are most impacted are getting the co-benefits they deserve, because cumulative impacts in the US context and many other parts of the world, that's decades and decades and decades. You have to be tracking that snapshot, and also over time that they're getting those deep benefits to deal with those deep issues.
And Isabel, do you have a quick 30 seconds comment? Well, if not, thank you very much. A round of applause to our excellent panelists. And we will continue this discussion, day 2 as well. And we have our last session, I understand, tomorrow on the next steps, what more we need to address. And we're going to take a quick coffee break, 10 minutes. And please be back by 16:22 to be exact. Thank you.